Hey everyone, welcome to For the Love of Language. This is our 8th episode, and I'm Authentically EJ here with Stacy the Linguist. I think we can do a little Q&A. So if anybody listening right now on Twitch wants to put any questions in the chat that you'd like us to touch on, we would definitely love that. I did also have a few questions come up from other people that we can bring up now as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll start with one that actually my partner asked a question after our Sapir-Whorf hypothesis episode, and he actually asked about colors because I mentioned colors very briefly in passing, but didn't actually dive into how that's related to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or, what the linguistic patterns around colors actually are. So we could dive into that a little bit first.
Yeah. So to kind of kick us off, there's this question that everybody will ask at some point in their life. And is my green the same as your green? Are we seeing the same color of blue? Is my pink your pink? And the answer that most scientists have is like, we don't know. Like, right? we can guess, like we can look at the wavelengths and be like, well, this wavelength and this wavelength are the same, but how we are perceiving it in our minds is very different. And a lot of people like to use language and say, like, especially in Japanese, for example, I don't know if anybody knows about Japanese, but in Japanese, they have the same word for blue as they do for green. And so a lot of people are like, oh, they must think that blue and green are the same thing. And that's not true.
Right. It'd be kind of similar to like most languages will have a small set of like what I'll call their primary color words. So in English, that would basically be the rainbow, right? Like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. You can have like really specific ones like azure or salmon, but those aren't like our primary,
yes,
color words that everybody knows and uses. But then when we get words like blue or green, we can just use adjectives and other descriptors attached to those words to describe what we're actually seeing and make things more precise. So an example of that I'm more familiar with is like in Russian, there's actually two different words for blue. There's a word for a dark blue and a word for a light blue. And it's not that as an English speaker, I can't tell a light blue from a dark blue. I just don't have a specific word. And so maybe mentally I'm categorizing them a little bit differently, but that doesn't necessarily mean that my actual perception is different. But the way that colors are perceived and stuff, there's been studies about it to kind of tie into the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and like, does this language that we're using to categorize colors impact how we see colors?
Yeah. And ultimately, the answer is like, we can all see all the different colors. Like if you were to take someone who maybe doesn't have as rich of a color vocabulary into a Home Depot, and you took them to that wall of colors for the paint section. I love that section. It's my favorite section. Best section in Home Depot. They can still talk about all the different variations of color, but they may not be able to say, this is blood red versus crimson versus versus this, like just because their vocabulary doesn't encompass that, right? But they can still be like, this red and this red are different reds.
Definitely. Yeah. So that's what I was referring to in the episode about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. There is one other really interesting thing about color that's a little tangential, but I think is worth bringing up because we probably won't have a whole episode on it.
Yeah.
But there's a pattern in languages, and this is kind of one of those universal patterns, like we were just talking about. But there's a pattern as to the order in which colors are not introduced, but exist in a language. So if a language only has like one color outside of black and white, it will usually be like red, I think. And then you'll add a color And if a language only has 4 colors, it'll be like black, white, red, and blue. There's like this pattern that colors are added in a language. So you can say if a language only has 7 color words, it's probably going to be these 7, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah. And we have Witter and Puggle in chat. Hi friends, good to see you. Asking, what about indigo? I've heard that it's a made up color somewhere between the blue and purple, so that rainbows would have 7 colors instead of 6 because 7 is a quote divine number. And like, I mean, all of those more specific colors are technically made up colors, right? Like we're just finding different words to describe a color that we like. We can recreate indigo, right? If it's not natural in the world, that's a different story. But the fact that we've been able to, like, I guess, recreate indigo means that it is a real color in some sense, and we can kind of differentiate it from blue and purple. And we just labeled it indigo. I think that's more of like a sociological thing, more of a cultural thing than it is like a linguistic thing, because it does like it is a made up color in that we kind of made it ourselves, but it is still perceptible and it is perceptibly different.
Yeah, it is super, super interesting. And I was actually, Ron, the fourth one. So all languages contain black and white. The third one is usually red, and then the fourth one is either green or yellow, and it progresses from there. But yeah, it is super interesting, and I like that cultural point as well, because there are lots of instances where culture will have a direct impact on language. Like maybe something becomes taboo, and so a word becomes a swear word. Like that's a very, very cultural thing that has a direct impact on language. So I think it's a really, really good question. I personally, when you say indigo, I actually don't have a clear vision in my mind of what that is relative to blue or purple. But yeah,
I'm very different, but you know me, I'm obsessed with colors. So.
Right? I like to keep things simple.
Yeah. So yeah, when it comes to like language and color, there are a bunch of different cultures and languages that have certain associations with colors and, you know, have different words for colors. But as I've kind of said before, and I'll say it again, and I'll say it till the day I fucking die, language is a tool, right? And so if there is a color that needs describing, a language will find a way to describe it. If that color is not like relevant or valuable or something, then they might not have like a singular word for it. Like to describe a certain yellow as like daffodil is a very like English thing to do. But not every language feels the need to do that, and that's okay.
Right.
But they will have a way of talking about the color that is like a daffodil. Like there are many ways of going about describing the color in that more like comparative way, being like, it is such that it has the property of X. And that's a way that most languages, if they don't have a specific color term, will talk about color terms.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a pretty good dive into that question. Is there anything else you would add there?
I don't think so, unless there is something like specific your dearest lovely partner had in mind. But I think that's a good just toss all to the wind, just kind of smattering all of the main points about color and the superior world hypothesis and general perception.
Right. Yeah. It's very, very fun stuff. You can always, read up more about language and color online if you want to dive in more. Another question that I got, and I'm so happy that I have family members who are listening in, but my mom asked if we could talk a little bit about corpora and, when it makes sense to create a corpus. Corpora is the plural of corpus, and what they're for and some stuff like that.
Yeah. So to break it down for the lay people, corpora, corpus means body. So you may have heard from like Legally Blonde about habeas corpus, which is some legal term that I don't really give a shit about. But it does mean something about the body, right? And so when in linguistics, when we're talking about corpora or a corpus, we're talking about a body that is essentially just made up, is it just a bunch of language data. It could be word lists, it could be sentences, it could be sociolinguistic interviews. And it's just this big, chunky, massive information book, database, whatever you want to call it, about a language.
And usually the difference between a corpus and a dictionary is that dictionaries will take specific words in isolation and define them.
Yeah.
The goal of a corpus is more to get language in context. So usually a corpus might include books, like Google Ngrams is a good example. You can do searches and see the usage of words historically in Google's books.
Yeah.
And so having a corpus will hopefully be a really, really massive collection of the language. You can have it with newspapers from a certain time period. You can have it with books. You can have it with spoken language. I've usually heard of corpora being more written though. But
that's interesting because I have it very much the opposite. Most of the corpora I interact with are like phonological and sociolinguistic, like interviews and sentences and stuff.
I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, it should also be noted that one of my Dutch colleagues, he built a Twitter corpora for a certain phenomenon in Dutch syntax. So even tweets can be a part of a corpus.
Yeah, definitely. And tweets are actually really, really easy to use. As a software engineer, it's actually really, really simple to write like a Python script and just collect a ton of tweets and like really quickly generate a corpus with different like words that you're searching for, different things like that. So Twitter is actually a really, really popular one for linguists to use in like college and stuff because their API makes it really, really easy to just grab data. One thing that I really like about a corpus that a corpus lets you do that like a dictionary doesn't is to find language collocates. So a collocate is like a word that usually appears next to another word. And so an example would be like next is going to be generally next to, or the word depend is usually going to be together with depend on. And so there's other ones where you can actually have multiple nouns together or different things, but using a corpus allows you to actually see how these individual words are used, which is super, super fun and one of the cool things about corpus. But yeah, when I was doing my linguistics classes, we would sometimes use corpora for different projects. There's some of them that are free and that you can just access online, but there's also some of them that you have to like pay to get access. And so if you can get to that through a university or sometimes a library account will give you access to them, that's pretty cool.
But yeah, when it comes, if there was anything else, I didn't want to like interrupt your thought.
Yeah, no, there was just one related question I wanted to dive into with corpora, but did you have a thought?
I was just going to say that linguists love corpora and we will build a corpora whenever we can.
Definitely. Yeah. And that actually kind of dives into my mom's kind of follow-up question was she knew someone who was working on an Egyptian Arabic corpus. Mm-hmm. And, Arabic is interesting because there's like a religious need to have the Arabic language be the same language as the Quran.
Yeah, the classic Arabic.
Yeah, classic Arabic. But obviously there are dialects and language has changed in Egypt versus in other Arabic speaking countries. And so my mom's follow-up question was, how do you decide when a language has diverged enough, when a dialect has diverged enough that it warrants creating a separate corpus?
It's a big question, Mom. It's a big, hard, messy question. If anyone was listening to our podcast last week, we talk about this a little bit. Sometimes it's political and it's based on geographical boundaries. And geographical boundaries, well, geography is like one thing, but like political boundaries are another thing, right? Sometimes it's geography, sometimes it's politics, sometimes it's like socio-linguistic stuff, like, like for example, a division in like Israel. We won't go into all of the nuances of that, but someone could, because of certain sociological factors, start to divvy out the language and assign it to like different groups of people because of like sociological factors. So there's a lot of drama that can go into deciding what is going to be a dialect and how you're going to call it and how it's different. And so a lot of that does get like political, unfortunately. But when we're talking about like linguistics, and if you were to just ask a linguist who didn't have to bend to the will of the great powers that be, then we might just associate it with certain patterns, right? So like in Arabic, in Egyptian Arabic, they use certain patterns pretty systematically, and we can see that, and we can see how that differs from like Moroccan Arabic, for example, that uses different patterns. So there are like very big tells that we can see that make that distinction. You see the same thing with like American English and like British English. There are certain patterns that are pretty systematic in American English. Doesn't really matter where you're from in America. There are still certain things that we would say, okay, this is still like American English, that are very different from like British English. So there are some linguistic factors that play into it, but a good chunk of the time it's politics and sociological factors, because if you group a person and their language in a way that they don't like, they get very upset. So you have to be careful.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there is an interesting question here. Someone posted in the chat, like, are dialects separate corpora? Or is it really just the same corpus in different contexts? And I think, part of this comes down to the decisions of the researcher, of the person creating the corpus, because I could go ahead right now and I could decide to create a corpus of, a group of American politicians' Twitter feeds, right? Like I could go ahead and I could create that corpus and I could define exactly what I want it to be. I could create a corpus of English on like a bunch of random internet pages that's actually a conglomeration of American and British and South African English without providing any distinctions. And it might be a useful corpus in some ways, but it wouldn't tell us anything about the differences between language. Versus if I decided to create a Utah corpus and a Tennessee corpus, creating those separately would then allow me to analyze the differences between them. So when it comes down to it, like Stacey said, like there's patterns that we can look for and distinctions we might look for. Like maybe if one location just uses a couple words differently from another location, that might not merit an entirely different corpus. But once you start to notice a lot of linguistic differences in words and maybe even in grammar, then I think linguists would be more motivated to try and separate those. But there is a continuum. It's not like there's a clear line and like a very well-defined set of rules that linguists follow. And so, we do look maybe at the social things. We do look at the political factors sometimes that separate language. And at the end of the day, you make a decision based on, the theory that you have, the hypothesis that you have, and what you're trying to find out.
Yeah. And Puggle here in chat says you make it sound like sticky notes on a whiteboard. And it's honestly true. Like there is no one giant corpora. There's no one corpus that we can all go to that is like perfectly organized. Like everybody has built their own version of a corpus and have their own sets of corpora. So this doesn't all exist in one spot. You kind of build a corpus based on your own research needs.
Definitely. And one of the cool things about a corpus as opposed to like a dictionary, because you're gathering so much information, you can do a lot of research in a single corpus, and you can find patterns that might seem to deviate from the rules that a language has. And a
Those
lot of the time you'll
prescriptive rules,
find
there's quotation marks for those who are listening.
yes, I put quotes on rules. When I was teaching Russian, I made it very clear whenever my students would ask, so are there exceptions to this? I'm like, there's always
exceptions.
I actually dislike calling things rules. I prefer calling them patterns, but that's a whole nother discussion that we can go into another day. But yeah, it's super, super interesting. And a lot of the time in a corpus as well, you'll actually find people using the same language in different ways. So maybe 30% of the time people will say things one way and the other 70% of people will say things a different way. And it gives you more insight into, how language is actually used, as opposed to having as much of the prescriptive influence, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, exactly. It's that natural language context that helps us linguists. I mean, it's sometimes not helpful because it's not systematic and there's a lot to kind of sort through, but it's better because we want to describe language as it is, not as it wants to be. Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think we have some time for one more question from Puggle. Our dear friend Commander Puggle here in Twitch chat says, how does this optimality theory, talking back to what I was talking about in my research, with the Wittgensteinian notion of language being established by public usage rather than by creation of linguistic rules? Yes. So if I'm understanding your question right, Puggle, and please feel free to clarify, the optimality theory does have like rules and constraints, but they are considered to be like natural, like rules and constraints, right? These are limits that are imposed on us by our cognitive abilities and by our linguistic abilities. They are not, I mean, there are some constraints that people have made that we call ad hoc, which means that they are just to push a certain theory or to do a certain function within the theory, but they are not prescriptive in the way that like, this is what the language should do. No, the constraints are meant to describe and predict what the language might do based on what we know about the language and its various patterns. I missed an operative verb there, fit. Yes, fit. But I think that's what you were aiming. Maybe that was what you were asking with your question. Feel free to clarify if I missed that.
Yeah, I kind of understand that. Like I said, I prefer calling them patterns versus rules. I think we're talking a little bit about two separate things, right?
Yeah.
There's like the rules that you're taught as quote unquote rules when you're learning a language that are like, when you're saying XYZ, conjugate the verb this way, or never end a sentence with a preposition. Like these are examples of rules that people are taught when learning a language. And then you have like these rules, the type that Stacy is talking about in optimality theory, that they're not like human prescribed rules that we're telling people of how to use language, but they are constrained by, what sounds are we capable of making? What are just the natural patterns that happen as language develops? And so I see those as two separate things, if that gives a little bit more insight.
Yes, they are two very separate things. And I think in prescriptive rules, we say that there are exceptions, but when we're talking about constraints, we say that they are violable. So ultimately, every constraint can be broken. There are like a million different exceptions to those constraints because not every language uses that rule, uses that pattern. So it in some senses it's meant to be broken, which is like a crucial part of why the theory works. Is we can have like a general set of what we think our brains are capable of, but then it's what our brains choose to be capable of, right? Which things do we prefer to use over the other? Because like I said, language is a tool, and sometimes someone prefers a Phillips head screwdriver over a flathead screwdriver. And that's okay. We just have to be able to describe why one might be better in one circumstance than another, why someone might want to choose that Phillips head over a flathead. I don't know if that helped or muddled the waters in understanding, but thank you for the question, Puggle. And I hope that clarified it a little bit further.
Yeah, I actually really like that analogy. That's kind of fun.
Yeah.
Cool. Do we want to call it there then for the day?
I think so. Thank you for your questions. You can find us on Instagram at For the Love of Language, and you can ask EJ and I questions there as well. So we are open books, and we hope to do more of these Q&As in the future.
We love having all of y'all as listeners. So yeah, thanks for tuning in.
Yep. And just remember, you can find this here on Twitch, the uncut version. However, if you want to see a slightly more spruced up version, we will have this available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. So feel free to check it out there. And you can listen back anytime you like. So thank you all so much. And we hope you guys have a great day.
Yeah. See y'all later.